Welcome back, everyone. LanceScurvX here, the Scurv podcast. Today was a great day. Beautiful sunshine, beautiful sights, fresh air, and peace and quiet. Very productive today. I wanted to speak about, let's just talk about the title. The Black History They Never Taught Us. Why are we discovering our greatness on social media? See, I've been thinking about something that deserves a serious conversation because many of us who went through the American public school system were taught history from elementary school all the way through high school. Yet somehow we grew up knowing only a small portion of Black history. We learned certain names, certain dates, certain struggles, and certain victories, which is all good. We were taught about slavery, segregation, civil rights, and a handful of major figures who became almost permanent fixtures of the February classroom, Black History Month. We learned those stories, and we should have learned them, but somewhere along the way, something important was missing. And now social media is exposing just how much more there was to the story. What's happening today through Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, podcasts, independent journalism, documentaries, and digital archives is forcing many people to realize just how much Black history they never encountered in school. Every day, somebody is introducing an audience to a Black inventor, scientist, engineer, mathematician, physician, entrepreneur, pilot, architect, computer scientist, astronaut, or researcher whose work contributed to the world we live in today. Some of these discoveries are so connected to everyday life that you have to stop and ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. Why didn't I learn about this when I was sitting in a classroom? On that note, I want to say, join us every Monday evening for me because I'm over in West Africa, but it will be posted on this site and on the YouTube channel across all social media with the King of Mondays, Brother Neil Frazier, aka Metamorphosis, right? Look in those archives of what we've been talking about. And I still had to shake my head because I may have heard of some of those names, but to go into detail, it was never served up to us in school. Why? That question becomes even more powerful when you realize that Black contributions aren't limited to some distant period before or immediately after slavery. Black people have contributed to transportation, medicine, communications, engineering, manufacturing, computing, aviation, space exploration, household technology, agriculture, military technology, and countless other areas of modern life. The Smithsonian has documented Black contributions to American invention and innovation, while NASA has documented generations of Black mathematicians, engineers, scientists, astronauts, and other professionals who helped advance America's space program. These aren't merely stories circulating on social media. They're documented parts of American history that deserve to be known. So I have to ask the question, why does so much of this feel like a discovery instead of an education? Why are so many of us encountering pieces of our own history for the first time while scrolling through a telephone in our hands? Why are people who left school decades ago suddenly learning about contributions that should have been part of the broader story of American progress all along. Those questions aren't accusations against every teacher who ever stood in front of a classroom. They're questions about what gets selected, emphasized, repeated, celebrated, and considered important enough to become part of the standard story. And before somebody gets defensive, I'm not saying that every teacher deliberately withheld information. I'm not saying every school system sat down and created a secret plan to hide Black achievement. The issue is bigger than that. I'm talking about the structure of what gets taught, the limitations of curriculum, the priorities of educational institutions, the historical biases that have shaped textbooks, and the fact that some stories are repeated so often that they become synonymous with an entire people's history. When the same narrow portion of Black history gets repeated year after year while enormous areas of Black achievement remain outside the conversation, we have every right to question the pattern and ask why the story was allowed to become so small. There's nothing wrong with celebrating the most famous figures in Black history. They earned their place, and their sacrifices, leadership, courage, and accomplishments should never be forgotten. The problem begins when those familiar names become almost the entire Black history lesson. We move from slavery to emancipation, from emancipation to segregation, from segregation to the Civil Rights Movement, and then from the Civil Rights Movement to a few familiar victories. February arrives. The same stories are brought forward. The same images appear on classroom walls. And then the month ends, and the subject often disappears back into the background. But Black history doesn't stop after the Civil Rights Movement. Black history didn't begin with slavery. Black achievement didn't begin when America finally decided to document it. And Black genius certainly didn't disappear after a handful of famous leaders became household names. There's an entire world of Black achievement sitting between the lines of the history many of us were taught. There are people who designed, calculated, engineered, invented, repaired, organized, researched, discovered, patented, tested, programmed, built, manufactured, explored, and solved problems. There are Black women and Black men whose work helped move society forward even when they weren't given the recognition, funding, access, or opportunities that others received. The Smithsonian has specifically documented how Black inventors and innovators contributed to American technology, including inventions that became predecessors to technologies people still recognize today. Its research also shows that Black innovation stretches across different periods and includes both famous inventors and lesser-known people whose contributions were overlooked and underrepresented. That should make us pause, because when you hear about a Black inventor connected to a traffic signal, a safety device, an early home security system, industrial machinery, or other practical technology, you begin to understand that Black history isn't simply a story about surviving America. It's also a story about building America. That distinction matters because there's nothing wrong with teaching the painful chapters of Black history. Slavery must be taught. Reconstruction must be taught. Segregation must be taught. Lynching must be taught. The Civil Rights Movement must be taught. Those stories matter because they explain how America became what it became. But if generations of Black children are taught primarily about what was done to Black people without equally learning what Black people accomplished despite those circumstances, we can accidentally create a history of Black people that's centered almost entirely around suffering. I don't want that kind of history to become the only history our children know. I want the child sitting in that classroom to understand that Black people weren't simply waiting for somebody to rescue them. Black people were creating, Black people were thinking, Black people were solving problems, Black people were inventing, Black people were educating themselves, Black people were building businesses, communities, institutions, technologies, families, movements, and entire cultural systems. That child needs to understand that intelligence didn't suddenly arrive in our community when somebody received a patent. The patent simply became one official record of an ability that had existed all along. This is where the conversation gets especially interesting, because we aren't talking about inventions that sit behind glass in a museum. We're talking about the modern world. We're talking about technology, engineering, computing, telecommunications, aviation, medicine, space exploration, and systems that became part of the foundation upon which newer technologies were built. We're living in a technological age where a person can carry more computing power in a smartphone than entire institutions possessed generations ago. We communicate instantly across oceans, see people in another country while sitting in our homes, use navigation systems, video calls, digital banking, artificial intelligence, medical devices, streaming platforms, and countless other technologies without ever stopping to ask, who helped create the systems that made modern life possible? Who? Tell me. It's time for the secrets to come out. Black people have been involved in that story. NASA itself has acknowledged Black Americans who contributed to the American space program and has highlighted the contribution of Black mathematicians, engineers, astronauts, scientists, and other professionals. That isn't social media folklore, that's documented history. The problem is that documented history doesn't automatically become commonly known history, and that's where we have to look more closely at how history gets transmitted from one generation to another. This is where social media has changed the game. Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, podcasts, independent websites, online archives, and digital communities have created something that previous generations didn't have at this scale. Ordinary people can research history, find archived material, examine documents, tell stories, and distribute information without waiting for a textbook publisher or school board to decide that the information deserves space. That's powerful because somebody can sit down today, type a name or invention into a search bar, and discover an entire history that might never have appeared in their classroom. Of course, that doesn't mean everything on social media is true. That's one of the biggest dangers of learning history through social media. Some stories are exaggerated. Some claims are completely false. Some inventions get incorrectly credited. Some viral videos remove important context. So we have to verify what we learn. That's not a problem. But the existence of misinformation doesn't erase the enormous amount of legitimate Black history that people are discovering online. In fact, the need to verify these stories can become part of the education itself, because when somebody discovers a Black inventor or scientist they never heard about, that discovery can lead them to patents, historical records, museums, newspapers, university archives, and other credible sources. That's how history becomes inspiration. A person can discover that an African-American couple developed a patented security system decades ago that used cameras, television monitors, microphones, speakers, and an alarm system in ways that anticipated features of modern home security. Suddenly, that's no longer just a story about one invention. It becomes a lesson about engineering, electronics, patents, surveillance technology, entrepreneurship, innovation, and the evolution of technology. More importantly, it becomes a lesson about Black participation in that evolution. Here's where I believe we have to be careful, but honest. There are many reasons why a particular story may not appear in a school curriculum. Teachers have limited classroom time. States and school districts establish standards. Textbooks have limited space. Curriculum changes slowly. Some subjects receive more attention than others, and historians and educators have to make decisions about which events they believe are essential. Historically, American education also hasn't always given equal attention to the experiences and accomplishments of every group. The Smithsonian's research on Black invention discusses barriers Black inventors faced, including racial discrimination, limited access to opportunity, and problems with receiving patents and commercializing inventions. So when we ask why we weren't taught these stories, the answer doesn't necessarily have to be one giant secret meeting where somebody decided, let's hide Black greatness. The reality could be more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. Sometimes exclusion doesn't require a conspiracy. Sometimes it happens through priorities. Sometimes it happens through neglect. Sometimes it happens because a curriculum continues doing what it has always done. Sometimes it happens because the people designing the curriculum don't know the history themselves. And sometimes it happens because society has historically been more interested in recording certain accomplishments than others. Whatever the reason, the result can be the same. People grow up without knowing the full story. That's why I don't believe we should waste all of our energy arguing about whether there was one giant intentional effort behind every omission. We should be asking a more useful question. What was left out? Why was it left out? And how do we make sure it's included going forward? That's a question that can actually produce something constructive. There's nothing wrong with celebrating the familiar names. What I want is to add thousands more. I want children learning about the mathematicians who helped solve complex problems, the engineers who pushed aerospace forward, the Black women who designed technologies inside the home and workplace, the scientists whose research changed medicine, the entrepreneurs who created industries when they weren't supposed to have access to capital, and the Black people who contributed to computing, telecommunications, manufacturing, architecture, agriculture, transportation, and every other field where human beings have solved problems. I also want children learning about contemporary Black achievement because Black history isn't supposed to be a museum exhibit. Black history is still happening. Black people are still creating. Black scientists are still researching. Black engineers are still designing. Black entrepreneurs are still building. Black artists are still creating. Black educators are still teaching. Black people across Africa and throughout the global diaspora are still contributing to the development of the modern world. If we only teach Black history as something that happened generations ago, we're creating the false impression that Black achievement belongs to the past. That matters because children need to see themselves as capable of creating the future. If the only Black history they encounter is a story of oppression, struggle, resistance, and survival, They can walk away understanding the pain without fully understanding the power. But when a child learns that somebody who looked like them entered a field that society said wasn't meant for them, solved a problem that seemed impossible, built something useful, explored somewhere humanity had never been, or contributed to technology that people still use today, something different happens. The lesson becomes personal. The child starts thinking, maybe I can do something too. That's why representation in history matters. It's not simply about making children feel good. It's about giving them evidence. Evidence that people who look like them have already done extraordinary things. Evidence that intelligence has no color. Evidence that innovation has no racial boundary. Evidence that obstacles don't automatically determine destiny. And evidence that the future doesn't belong only to the people who have traditionally been allowed to imagine themselves inside of it. At the same time, I believe we have a responsibility that goes beyond blaming the school system. We have to become researchers. We have to become readers. We have to examine primary sources. We have to look at patents. We have to visit museums. We have to read biographies. We have to question viral claims. We have to distinguish between something that sounds good and something that can actually be documented. Because if we're serious about reclaiming our history, we can't replace one incomplete version of history with another incomplete version. We need the truth, not mythology, not propaganda, not exaggerated stories designed to make us feel good for 5 minutes. Not sanitized history, not self-hatred, not racial superiority. History. When institutions such as the Smithsonian and NASA document Black innovation, scientific achievement, and contributions to space exploration, we don't need to embellish those stories. The documented achievements are already remarkable. The truth is powerful enough without exaggeration. Maybe that's why these discoveries hit people so hard. When somebody discovers a Black inventor they never heard about, they're not simply learning a fact. They're confronting a gap in their own education. They are realizing that their understanding of Black achievement may have been much smaller than reality. That can produce anger. It can produce pride. It can produce frustration. It can produce curiosity. But hopefully, it produces something even more important. It produces hunger. A hunger to learn, a hunger to investigate, a hunger to teach our children, a hunger to understand where we came from and what we've contributed. Because once you realize that you've only been given pieces of the story, you start looking for the rest. And that's where I believe we are right now. We're looking for the rest of the story. At this point, I don't think the question should be whether Black people have made extraordinary contributions. The historical record already answers that. The question is, why so many people didn't know about them? That's the conversation I want us to have. I don't want it to become another argument where everybody chooses a political side and starts screaming at each other. I want us to ask better questions about who decides what becomes part of the curriculum, who decides which historical figures receive repeated attention, how often our textbooks are updated, how much Black scientific and technological history is integrated into ordinary science and technology classes, how much African history is taught before European colonization, how much attention is given to Black women inventors and innovators, and how much contemporary Black achievement is being documented. Most importantly, I want us to ask how we make sure the next generation doesn't have to discover its own history by accident. If Black people help build America, then Black history isn't some separate subject that gets temporarily inserted into the calendar. It's part of the American story. Let's face it, the same way we teach American science, American politics, American business, American art, American literature, American military history, and American technology throughout the year, Black participation in those areas should be part of those subjects throughout the year. If a Black engineer helped advance aerospace, that belongs in the aerospace lesson. If a Black inventor contributed to transportation technology, that belongs in the technology lesson. If a Black scientist contributed to medicine, that belongs in the science lesson. If a Black entrepreneur built a major business, that belongs in the business lesson, right? We shouldn't have to wait until February to hear about them. Black History Month shouldn't be the only time we learn Black history. It should be the month that reminds us how much more there is to learn. And maybe that's the real opportunity in front of us. Instead of waiting for somebody else to tell us what parts of our history are important, we can become serious students of our own history. We can research the patents. We can read the biographies. We can visit the museums. We can study the documents. We can teach our children directly. We can challenge incomplete textbooks. We can demand better curriculum. And we can do all of that without needing to diminish anybody else. Because learning about Black greatness doesn't require believing that Black people are greater than everybody else. It simply requires acknowledgement that Black people have contributed far more to the development of the modern world than many of us were ever taught. That's not arrogance. That's not hatred. That's not division. That's history. I don't believe learning Black history should make anybody else feel threatened. If anything, it makes American history more accurate. America becomes more impressive when we tell the truth about everybody who helped build it. The inventions become more interesting, the scientific breakthroughs become more meaningful, the space program becomes more complete. The story of American business becomes richer. The story of American technology becomes deeper, and the story of Black America becomes much larger than slavery, segregation, civil rights, and a few famous photographs. We were here. We were thinking. We were building. We were creating. We were solving problems. We were pushing boundaries. We were contributing, and we're still doing it. That's why I refuse to accept a version of Black history that makes Black people appear as though our greatest contribution was simply surviving what was done to us. Survival was extraordinary, but survival wasn't the only thing we do. Maybe social media has accidentally exposed something that the traditional education system never fully addressed. Information is no longer controlled by a small number of institutions. A teenager with a smartphone can discover a patent that was filed more than 100 years ago. A retired person can discover a scientist they never heard about. A parent can find an archive and teach their children something they were never taught. A creator can spend an afternoon researching a forgotten inventor and introduce that person to millions of people. That's an extraordinary development, but we have to use that power responsibly. We can't simply say, I saw it on TikTok, so it must be true. We have to investigate. We have to verify. We have to compare sources. We have to learn how history is actually documented. And once we confirm these stories, we need to make sure they don't disappear again. We need to turn viral curiosity into permanent knowledge. So when I ask why we're learning so much of this now through social media, I'm not asking the question because I believe every teacher intentionally withheld information from us. I'm asking because the pattern deserves examination. If millions of people can reach adulthood without knowing about major Black contributions to American technology, science, medicine, engineering, aviation, computing, and space exploration, then something about the way history has been communicated clearly needs to be reconsidered. Maybe the answer is institutional bias. Maybe it's limited curriculum space. Maybe it's outdated textbooks. Maybe it's educational priorities. Maybe it's the slow pace of curriculum reform. Maybe it's a combination of all of these things. But whatever the reason, the solution should be the same. Teach more. Teach deeper. Teach the painful history. Teach the painful history. Teach the victorious history. Teach the complicated history. Teach the scientific history. Teach the technological history. Teach the entrepreneurial history. Teach the African history. Teach the global Black history. And teach the history that's happening right now. Because Black history doesn't belong to February. Black history isn't a classroom decoration. Black history isn't a collection of famous faces placed on a bulletin board for 1 month. Black history is American history, and Black history is world history. If Black people help build the nation, then our contributions belong everywhere the story of America is being taught. How about that? I believe the greatest danger isn't that Black people don't know enough about their history. The greatest danger is that we can become comfortable with knowing only the portion of history that somebody else decided was important enough to place in front of us. Once we become comfortable with that limited version, we stop asking questions, we stop searching, we stop digging. And when we stop digging, we can mistake an incomplete story for the whole truth. That's why I believe this new age of digital information can become something powerful if we use it correctly. Social media can be noisy, shallow, misleading, and filled with misinformation. We know that. But it can also open doors that previous generations never had. A person can discover a historical archive today that might have taken weeks or months to find decades ago. A young person can hear about a Black scientist, inventor, engineer, or explorer and immediately begin researching that person's life. That curiosity can become education. And maybe that's the real opportunity in front of us. Instead of waiting for somebody else to tell us what parts of our history are important, we can become serious students of our own history. We can research the patents. We can read the biographies. We can visit the museums. We can study the documents. We can teach our children. We can challenge incomplete textbooks. We can demand better curriculum. And we can do all of that without needing to diminish anyone else. Because when the full story is finally told, Black history doesn't become smaller, America doesn't become smaller, human achievement doesn't become smaller, the story becomes bigger, the truth becomes richer, and the next generation gets to inherit something better than a handful of familiar names repeated every February. They get to inherit an entire legacy of people who thought, created, invented, endured, organized, explored, built, and changed the world. So I'll leave you with the question that started this entire conversation. Why are so many of us discovering our greatness on social media instead of learning about it in school? I don't believe we should be satisfied with a simple answer. I believe we should investigate the curriculum, examine the history, verify the claims, uncover the stories, and keep asking questions. Because if the next generation is going to build something greater than what we inherited, they need to know that the people who came before them were already building, inventing, calculating, exploring, creating, and changing the world, the entire world. And that's the part of Black history I want us to talk about all year long. Not because February doesn't matter, But because 12 months matter, Black history isn't a seasonal subject. Black history isn't a classroom decoration. Black history isn't a collection of short stories that gets pulled from a shelf once a year and then put away. Black history is American history. Black history is world history. And Black achievement is still being written right now as we speak. The question isn't whether our people have contributed. The question is how much more there is for us to discover, document, teach, and remember. Much love to you all. I hope you've been inspired by these words. LanceScurv out. On to the next one. Peace.